Thanks, Jack.
Should we maybe change the time, given that it is past 6 p.m. Right,
I
go
think-
18:05.
Yeah, that's better. Do that.
Wow, the yellow legal pad that I have not seen in so long.
Some of us are still thoroughly entrenched in 2010.
Oh, but it's also partially because they don't sell yellow legal pads anymore.
Fair enough.
I don't want to go back to 2010. I was far below the legal age.
This is, yeah.
I hated it then.
Classic.
So the funny thing is I did switch mostly to computer note taking, but I don't like taking notes on a laptop while watching.
Inting, mute yourself.
Hello.
Do you want to mute yourself for 2 seconds? Here you go. Jack, check messages.
Can you send on Facebook, because the Zoom chat will come up?
Oh, I was basically just going to say, do you want to take away the screen share and
Oh.
they can start now. Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. Cool. Okay, CAs, you are free to impart your wonder on us.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Geneva and Jack, for putting this together. So backed by popular demand, we're going to be just doing a quick motion debrief on today's motions. So the partial double Octos, the ESL Quarters, as well as the open Octos. To take us away, here is Fred.
Okay, fantastic. So let's start with a little bit of a climate apocalypse fireside chat about our partial double Octo. So I'm just going to start out with a general bit about the debate, just in terms of characterization and framing. So I think that the first thing to note in this debate is that there's obviously a couple of different important clashes that go into the round. I'm going to be taking most of what we're going through just from the testing that we did for this motion when we decided to set it. So that should be pretty helpful. I think that two of the main things that we need to start off with are first, just some basic characterization bits, right? So obviously an issue for Gov and Op in this debate is what constitutes radical action. And there's likely to be a good degree of back and forth on this. I think that there's pretty clear reasons why it is that a Gov team would want to avoid radical action that reaches to the level of, you know, burning down the entirety of the ExxonMobil, like headquarters. And similarly, I think Op isn't going to want Gov to be able to escape their burden of that radical action, potentially harming people or leading to some degree of violence. So a big part of this clash is going to be where the characterization falls, what that action is likely to look like, and how much control environmental movements even have over their membership to ensure that things happen as they please or as they wouldn't. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing that I would say about a debate like this is that this is a debate where each side has some intuitive advantages, right? So the intuitive advantage that Gov goes in with in this debate is a status quo advantage, which is to say that there is, and certainly there's great op mitigation to this, but there is reason to believe that climate action has been slower than many would like over recent years, and that much is getting worse over time. And that puts op in a little bit of a tough position because they are, at least to a certain extent, defending the status quo, right? Whereas the advantage that op has, I think, is a pretty straightforward one as well, which is it's easy to associate radical action, particularly if we're talking about things like bombing pipelines or any other kind of violence, as something that people generally don't really like very much, and in fact can react quite poorly to. So another aspect of this debate is how each team is able to mitigate those advantages, right? How Gov mitigates the potential disadvantage of how radicalism can turn people off and can make the movement less palatable, and how opposition is able to deal with the status quo problem, if you believe that that is a problem. So let's go through a couple of arguments per side, since I already did a little bit of setup. So in terms of the Gov side, there's a list of different claims that can be made. Obviously, this is going to be a bit of an overview. So, I will not have 7 mechanisms for each of these independent claims. That being said, I think the first thing that would end up being like a pretty important argument on the government side is an argument about basically infringing on these types of projects themselves, right? So the basic idea being that there are many environmentally damaging projects, whether they be pipelines or other kinds of actions that themselves do damage to the environment and that can be halted by virtue of radical environmental action, and that wouldn't be able to be halted otherwise, that trying to shut down those kinds of projects through protest or legal mechanisms at best, even if you're successful, takes an incredible amount of time, and there's lots of reasons to believe that those mechanisms would not end up being successful. So at a basic level, I think there's an argument to be made that you can stop or at least slow down these projects in a way that can gain you some benefits in terms of stopping the worst kinds of pollution, right? Examples, again, whether this be pipelines or other things. Another argument that I think that you could have on Gov here is that there's just a degree of urgency, right? That given the state of the climate and many of the tipping points that exist in our fight against climate change, that we need to take action that is more radical as a mechanism to ramp up the urgency. Now, I think what becomes, I think that the way that this argument is framed is quite important, because it is likely going to be difficult if Gov tries to just make an argument that, well, look, this is going to be popular, that people are going to, in general, respond well to radicalism. I'm sure that there are teams that are smarter than I am and could make this claim well, but ultimately it seems like a fairly high burden claim. So a reasonable way of trying to approach this would just be to say that there's a certain degree of urgency that requires greater action, and then there's ways that you can mitigate some of the easy responses that op might have about why it is that this is going to spark some kind of backlash. The first, I think, way that you can make a case that this will actually lead to some popular support is by making some analogies to other social movements over the past, pointing out that in many circumstances where there was a radical fringe within a social movement, as well as a more moderate fringe, that the existence of the radical fringe actually made it easier for the moderate fringe to be able to, I shouldn't say moderate fringe, that's actually kind of an oxy. Anyway, for the moderate faction to be able to negotiate and potentially make it so that they were able to gain some concessions by virtue of them being targeted by politicians as a way of trying to push radicals outside of the political center. The next thing that I would say is that there's also a case that you can make on government. This is going to lead to, like, a failure to take this kind of action is going to lead to activist detachment. There's been a pretty big problem that we've seen in the climate movement over the last 2 to 3 years, where activists are becoming disheartened with the fact that nothing seems to be being accomplished quickly enough, that the fight seems futile, and it's pretty easy to explain why it is, that having active, enthusiastic members of a movement is necessary for being able to ensure that you get anything done. The basis of all movements is, what is a movement but it's people? Anyway, so the last thing that I would say here, and there's obviously more arguments that you could have on proposition, but there's some framing that I think is potentially interesting for closing teams, depending on how it is that your front half ended up setting up the debate, that can potentially weaponize some of the easy op mitigation against them, right? So one thing that I think it's likely op is going to try and say is that this is very likely to be unpopular, and that a lot of this can end up being weaponized against you. I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second. And a way that we can get around this on Gov is by potentially saying, look, it's very unlikely, given how people prioritize issues, whether it be the economy or other kinds of issues, that popular support is the most important thing in this debate. Ultimately, what we should be trying to strive for as a movement is where we can make the most change, and where we can make the most change is by addressing the incentives of companies and politicians, which have some incentives that exist outside of just pure public support, right? For companies, that those incentives are obvious, that's profit, right? And their ability to ensure that they are maintaining it, as well as for politicians, just basic stability, although obviously they're impacted by popular will. Okay, I spent too long on the gov, so let's move to the opposition. I think that the first thing is that obviously there's a lot of good mitigation that you can use against some of the prop bits about nothing is changing, pointing out some of the momentum that exists against climate change, about how generally perceptions are changing and that young people are demanding more action here. I don't think that the point of this mitigation is necessarily to try and suggest that, like, well, look, we're completely satisfied with the status quo, but rather to mitigate the extent to which Gov is going to be able to try and outframe you just by saying, oh, well, the status quo is so bad that we have to try something different. Which leads me to my second bit of strategy here, which is in these debates, and this is actually, I think, quite important advice for any debates like this, it's very common for Gov to use a status quo bias to say, well, look, things are so bad right now that you must accept my policy, right? That my policy must solve this problem, or that my approach must solve this problem because things are just so bad. But it is a totally viable strategy for opping around like this to say, well, you just make things worse, right? You don't necessarily need to win a debate by saying that your side is going to be a panacea or make things better. Certainly you can try that on opposition, but I think that there are multiple paths on opposition for you to be able to try and win a debate of this kind. So what are some of the other arguments that I think come out here? First is just the idea that this reduces support. A big part of this is that you can't control the messaging, right? So one thing that Gov is going to try and frame around is like, we're gonna do this this is likely to be done in very reasonable ways. They're unlikely to target small businesses or workers because members of the movement are very conscious of what it is that public support is going to look like, and they care about that public support. But the problem with that argument is that they don't control the messaging, right? It's not as if we have a lot of climate activists who are on the boards of Fox News and other major media establishments. So it's very, I think, effective for OP to point out that the messaging gets controlled by people whose interests are often at odds with the environmental movement. And it is very, very easy to frame radical action in a way that will upset people and that will make them angry. And the second part of this is that it's also difficult for wide, massive movements like the environmental movement to control people who are within that movement, and permitting some degree of radicalism can allow for unfortunate things to happen, whether this be some kind of violence against working class people or actions that would end up blowing up in a way that the environmental movement couldn't necessarily control. The other bit that I think is somewhat related to this from OP is that just the notion that this also means that the government side can't credibly disassociate themselves from extreme actions, right? So if Gov tries to make the argument about moderating, and it's like, oh, well, we can use this to our advantage to allow the moderate flank to be able to negotiate with governments because they seem so much more reasonable by comparison, that's not really effective if they're not able to disassociate themselves with that radical fringe, right? If there's not an ability to be able to engage in that disassociation, and there's lots of reasons to believe that would be difficult, in part because the movement seems to be supporting some versions of that can be a pretty big problem for them. Other bits of argumentation that we get on opposition are that governments can now scapegoat protesters for all kinds of problems, suggesting that protesters and the environmental movement are at fault for rising energy prices or other things that can end up just being harmful in the aggregate. And then lastly, I also think there's a pretty easy argument to be made on opposition about the extent to which this can harm regular people, right? Like that even if Gov wants to take the lower burden version of this and say, we're not going to target small businesses and we're going to try and only engage in the kinds of radical action that would impact companies. There are like working people who work on pipelines. The cost of fuel that you are able to get probably is impacted by how efficiently energy is transported. And there's lots of reasons to believe that people would end up seeing and internalizing those costs and then associating that with the environmental movement itself. And you can weaponize that quite easily to suggest that they're going to make things worse. So yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of the coverage for the PDOs. Hopefully our climate catastrophe fireside chat wasn't too terrible. And that's it for me. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, to continue the theme of let's burn everything down, I am here to talk about the ESL Quarterfinals motion, which is this House opposes the rise in anti-establishment discourse. We're really on a roll with the theme here, guys. I think, you can clearly tell there was something behind the scenes. Okay, so just going to start with some general thoughts about motions, about discourse and narratives, which I think are just going to be quite helpful when thinking about anti-establishment discourse in particular. So the first thing you always want to ask when you have a motion that's like about this message that's going on in society is just literally, what is this discourse? What does it consist of? What does it entail? And why did it eventually come up? So of course, with anti-establishment, I think the thing that most teams immediately run to is, this is about political organizations, but keep in mind that anti-establishment really does mean quite a lot of other things as well. This could also be distrust of courts, for instance, your legal institutions. It could also be your distrust of experts. It could be your distrust of central authorities. All of these things could potentially fall under anti-establishment, which also, I think, broadens the scope of your debate if you just think about the characterization in a little more detail. The second, I think, question you always want to ask is literally just, what is the status quo and what then happens if we remove this particular form of discourse? So I think in this motion, there are two aspects you can kind of think of. The first is, in status quo, what are the problems that are causing this form of discourse to arise in the first place? And I think probably most teams were able to just pick out that people are buying into this form of discourse because they are feeling fairly dissatisfied with the problems that are going on in society. There are certain factors that are, of course, within the government's control, but of course, there are also factors outside the government's control, such as, for instance, a global pandemic. So given that this is the case, you might then want to consider, if these factors already exist, what then changes once we remove the anti-establishment discourse? And here you can kind of consider what kinds of institutions we have in our society. That means without anti-establishment discourse, you might either get something significantly worse or something significantly better. And I'll just go into that in a little more detail when I talk about science. The third, I think, is just a discussion of who buys into this form of discourse, like who just ends up finding this messaging most persuasive, and who is on the fringes and is probably influenced to some degree or another by it. And for those individuals that find the discourse most persuasive, are these also individuals that are just unlikely to change their actions on either side, given that if they've already got, fairly radical inclinations? Does the addition of this discourse really dramatically change anything about the way in which they respond or the way in which they behave? So for example, if we were talking about saying, the people that are most impacted by anti-establishment discourse and most likely to buy in are the individuals that are already the most vulnerable and isolated from society, then the question becomes, look, let's say you add the discourse back in and then you're telling them they can now make a tangible action. Are they actually going to act on this, or will they feel further alienated from society? And then you get a discussion about the margins of change there. I think last of all, this is the last general piece of thing that's just really useful for discourse debates. You kind of think of how the discourse is transmitted, meaning when you have the transmission of discourse, it can be through social media, it can be through media channels, but the point is you need to think about whether or not it's done in a relatively contained manner or a relatively inflammatory manner. And that, of course, characterization is up to teams to discuss within the debate. Okay, so just some general thoughts about the Gov and up on this before I hand over to Hadar very quickly. I think on Gov, there's just quite obvious arguments that doing this just threatens state institutions and specifically threatens the institution of democracy, especially if you are talking about anti-establishment for the things that are really key features of the way a democracy functions. So for instance, questioning things like the vote and the legitimacy of various votes means that you are unlikely to trust those votes in the future, also meaning that you are less likely to get people to buy into those institutions. I think, of course, the other thing you want to discuss here is not only are you eroding faith in democratic institutions, you are also potentially reducing faith in the discussion of experts, because remember what we said earlier, the point is that this discourse does not necessarily only include institutions, it also includes different sources of authority and the people whom you believe. So this might also mean empowering anti-vaxxer discourse, it might mean empowering fake news or things like things along those lines. So there's a lot of punishment of expertise going on. Last of all, I think there's a very big discussion to be had about the kinds of change that you kind of want. So of course, with anti-establishment discourse, it's a very like all or nothing kind of discourse. You're not really being like, we are here to make slow progressive change. You are very much pushing for a dramatic overhaul of the kinds of institutions that you want. So there is then a discussion here. Okay, so first of all, maybe you don't get the dramatic change that you want. Do you get some kind of trickle-down effect that essentially means you can get slow progressive change another way? Or if you are having this dramatic overhaul of the system, what then happens? Are you able to really rebuild institutions from scratch? To what extent is this possible? To what extent do other political groups respond to you? So here you can think about how political parties respond to outsider factions and how they actually try to shift their own boundaries to accommodate this for fear of losing votes or for fear of opting out or just trying to capture a different voter base. All of these are things you could probably consider. Okay, I probably mentioned earlier, this obviously isn't a comprehensive list. It's just going to be general thoughts about the motion and directions you can go in. There are, of course, many smaller arguments packed under this that you can also access. On opposition, probably what you want to do is switch to push a really strong counterfactual on this and just go, look, this anti-establishment discourse has done a lot of good things in making us more skeptical of authority and of course all the accountability arguments that come from that. And then just point out, look, without this kind of discourse, you essentially have a situation where institutions hold a ton of power and almost all of that power is concentrated in the hands of establishment. So for instance, you can think of very established media sources. You can think of the kinds of demographic groups politicians come from. You can think of, you know, indefinite tenure, indefinite term limits for large institutions. All of these things kind of mean without this, you might very plausibly have a situation where there is actually quite little space for critique and discussion of these kinds of various state institutions. So presumably you could get more accountability through this if you're able to just increase the skepticism a little bit. The second is, I think you can argue that radical change is very often just necessary at the point when your state institutions have been failing for years and creating the kinds of problems that are precisely pushing these people to the anti-establishment discourse. It's just, I think, important to recognize that perhaps slow and steady change just isn't going to get you anywhere. So perhaps you should try a different kind of tactic. In addition to that, I think we can probably argue that this kind of anti-establishment discourse is just also quite good at raising the awareness of everybody else in terms of the problems that are happening. It actually provides a strong motivation for individuals to engage in politics, or at least in one very specific brand of politics, which could be better than plausibly them opting out entirely or just being very politically apathetic. Could also discuss how this means that you tend to blame the system rather than blaming individual groups, which could also be very beneficial for the kinds of groups that you want to impact. So all of those are just potential arguments you can also reach for here. I think what I would just say to close off this is a debate where it's like very easy to get caught up in the details, like, oh, is it better in right-wing parties? Is it better in left-wing parties? Is it better for Democrats or Republicans? Is it better for developed or developing? I would say that sometimes, just to cut through the mess, you need to really start thinking about it in terms of generalities first, the sort of big picture framing questions about what this discourse looks like, why people engage in it, how it's transmitted and how it's received, before then considering, all right, then, how does it impact all of these different groups? Because I think it can be too easy to get caught up in the details sometimes, and that means you miss the rest of the debate. Okay, so now slightly less burning people down, not eating landlords. Here comes Hadar for the Octo finals.
Yeah, as a famous fan of eating landlords and against capitalism, I think I'll start similarly to Anthony with just general thoughts of how to approach these kinds of motions, and then moving into specific argumentations. And I think there's a general thing to be said about every motion, and especially in policy debates. I would usually start with actually looking at the wording of the motion and identifying the burdens that it's likely to set forth. I think something that is often a common mistake in those things, especially for top-half teams, is misidentifying potential challenges in advance in prep. So let's go one by one. I'll pull out the exact wording. First is, this House would ban. There are two conclusions that we can get from every motion starting with this House would ban. The first is, there might be some justification claims. I think in other motions it's likely to be more relevant, although I do think there's a justification argument in existence in this debate. I think the bigger thing to think of, which is less obvious perhaps, is banning is a blanket form of policy. That is, there is a question of why specifically go to such extreme measures, where oftentimes oppositions will try to water down a lot of the government benefits by saying we can regulate, we can limit to a significant extent, and so on. And we can think of an endless list of potential regulations to have in this debate, right? Like limiting or capping the number of apartments an individual corporation can own in a single neighborhood, or such as like bans on price gouging and regulations that prevent people from being able to increase above a certain percentage of what was agreed upon in initial rent contracts, and so on at a certain speed. We can move on to more and more, but I think a big thing to understand from this is governments kind of want to think in this debate why alternatives are not enough, why you have to go to the very extreme. And there are many potential answers to this, yeah? You can try and argue something along the lines of having companies with so much power in the market allows them significant degree of control and lobbies, that prevents these regulations. Do note, however, given the way that fiat functions in the debate, if you have the fiat to bend, at least in the immediate term, opposition also has the fiat to regulate. So it means that in order for this claim to work, government wants to prove why in the long term you are going to lose this fiat, why now we are still able to ban, but regulations are not going to be sustainable, and the more power these companies accumulate, the less we are all going to be able to still enforce regulations against them. I think an alternative way to handle this is also just manage to challenge on how valid and powerful alternatives actually are. I think this is something that people don't often enough do in debating, but the common challenge of, oh, there is an alternative, let's regulate, usually looks like, here are 30 seconds of a list of 5 different policies that each could be completely debatable on itself without defending either one of them. So I'd be like, yeah, I think probably rent control is a worse alternative. It has led to many horrible outcomes. If opposition wants to choose an alternative, be my guest, counterprop it, defend it properly, and then I can engage it. So this is one thing to think of. Next, this also when corporate residential landlords. When the corporate residential landlords are defined as corporations that own and maintain multiple apartments for the purpose of renting them out for residential use. There are 3 things we need to identify about this in terms of what are the burdens that it sets forth. First, and I think this is the one that is most trivial for people to understand, is this is specific to corporate landlords as opposed to individuals. It's not about your grandma who wants to rent her own apartment to someone else. Secondly, and I think somewhat less intuitive to people, is the idea that this refers to specifically corporate residential landlords, meaning that alternatives that might still be legal under the debate are things such as building duplexes in order to rent them to corporate companies, such as a building of offices for WeWork or whatnot, and companies that can therefore rent my rooms or apartments for work purposes. And the third thing that we can infer from this wording is that this debate is about only the landlords that are corporations, not, for example, corporations that build houses in order to sell them without renting them. All of these are important because a lot of the argumentation we're going to run through in this debate is going to largely hinge on what is the actual counterfactual in the motion. And a common mistake that can happen for all teams in this debate is asserting what the likely counterfactual is, usually based on what is convenient for them to assume, and then not actually proving it. So let's go through actual arguments. If I am OG, presumably the first and intuitive thing I want to claim is that currently the existence of corporate landlords leads to massive increase of prices, that they get some form of monopolization or catalyzation of the market. It is hard to compete them, and this harms individuals. First, let's discuss the question of what's the alternative. And I think here, a first way to identify in this debate, based on what we just discussed, is what happens on the alternative. If I'm OG, probably the most useful characterization for me is to argue that the alternative to this is companies are going to build houses in order to sell them. This allows me to show more affordability of selling houses, as well as preventing companies from getting too much power in the renting sector, and therefore potentially also decreasing prices there. A second alternative I can discuss is to try and show why individual landlords are sufficient in their market power in order to create an incentive for construction. Either is fine. I think the first is easier. The important thing is I cannot let opposition get away with saying that this would lead to a just shortage of apartments, too little construction. And this is crucial because there are 2 burdens often skipped when running the first gov argument of what is why we're likely to see lowering prices in the renting market. The first is the problem solution match up. It is very tempting for government to analyze the easy side of the story, why there is a problem in the status quo, why corporate landlords own a massive chunk of the market and are able to therefore limit access to competitors of it and therefore increase prices. It is much harder to prove that the motion would solve it. To solve this problem, we need to prove an alternative source of competition that will be created, someone else who will be able to either sell or rent houses to individuals. If opposition gets away with proving less houses will be constructed, you are not solving the problem of unaffordability of houses, you're just harming the supply. So this is the first thing to think of. A second thing to think of when we run this argument is identify the difference between incentive and ability. I think incentive is when we analyze why companies want to skew the market and prevent competition, whereas ability is being able to analyze exactly how they do this. And concreteness is key in those kind of actual analysis. That is, it is very tempting to say something such as, corporations will try to intimidate their competitors. And then it begs the question of how? I'm a competitor, what would they do to me? How do you stop me? And there are many things you can describe here, yeah? Maybe they buy apartments of competitors so that they don't have competition. Maybe they can afford to do things such as making the prices of their rent in the short term so low that they're uncompetitive, that any competition will just die out. And then once they lose competition, they can increase prices afterwards. Maybe they can use lobbyism to prevent competition via regulations that will create this via different forms of zoning laws, etc. All of these are plausible ways. There are many other plausible ways. The important thing is not just to show they want to, but show that they are able to. So moving then to the other side of this clash on the price of rent from opposition. What does opposition want to argue? The most basic argument opposition wants to run in this debate is probably something around the lines of less houses, supply, demand. If you are like they need to meet each other, if you have an undersupply and still high demand in the market, this means you are likely to have a shortage of apartments that people then can't afford to, and we're just making the problem worse. What does then opposition need to consider in order to make this argument actually strong? First, opposition as well wants to engage the counterfactual. If the counterfactual is going to be these companies just sell these houses rather than renting them, the opposition claim is becoming rather weak, and there's plenty of incentive to still construct new houses, even if you can't rent them, because you can still profit of them in other manners. So opposition, to avoid this, wants to do one of the following. Either A, show why alternative models are not profitable enough. So maybe not enough people can afford to buy houses for me to be able to make it a profitable reason for me to buy complexes. Or maybe the only people who buy houses as opposed to rent are from the upper class or the upper middle class. And therefore it might be still an incentive to construct houses like which are single big houses for the wealthier population, but less of an incentive to build affordable housing of duplex, big buildings, etc. Because the people who usually go to them want to rent them, not to buy them, they can't afford to buy them. An alternative way to do this is to prove from opposition that the likely alternative isn't going to be to these companies moving into building houses to sell them, but rather some other form of alternative. Either they don't build at all, or I think an easier thing to prove that they just move more to alternative sectors rather than the residential one. They can build hotels, they can build office buildings, and so on. So this is the first thing to think of when we run this argument from opposition. I think the second thing to think of when running the argument from opposition on a shortage of housing is a bit more on why is the source of the problem actually one that is about supply and demand. Now, this sounds trivial and intuitive, and in many debates it will not be challenged, but it could very well be. I think there's a very potential gov mitigation that says that the problem isn't supply. Most of the areas where we see hiking prices of housing are the center of cities, which are already overcrowded and overpopulated, and there's just not actual room to build more in them. You have like skyscrapers across the board, and you can't really construct much more than you already did unless people are going to like live in sardine boxes. This means that Gov can claim the single biggest thing we can affect is not the number of houses available, but rather their price, their accessibility. And this makes obviously the Gov material stronger. So opposition wants to prove that the problem is indeed one of a shortage of supply rather than one of inflated prices of the existing supply. Second clash. There's also a discussion to be had here about which alternative do we prefer. Do we think home ownership or rent are preferable models for society. As we discussed earlier, at least part of the alternative is likely to be some of these corporations moving to selling. And by the way, this is a general tip about these, what's the counterfactual sort of questions in debate. Usually there's more than one. When we listed earlier that corporations can do either of these options, there are many corporations. Probably some of them will do the former and some will do the latter and so on. So I would concede that at least some of them would probably move into selling houses. And others would probably move into corporate models of renting it to offices or hotels, etc. And some of them would maybe not construct in the first place. And the question is going to be on the numbers on each of those different options. Since we have to acknowledge then that part of the trade-off in the debate is between rent and home ownership, this opens another clash on which do we prefer. The gov tends to be more intuitive to people for some reason. So home ownership, really quickly, we usually argue things such as A, significantly more stable. You can't evacuate me from a home that I bought. You can't kick me out. Secondly, it is something that creates more stability in terms of being able to make plans around it. If I live in the same place for many, many years, it is easier for me to develop a career rather than move in between changing jobs. It creates usually more of an ability for people to design the home in a way that is convenient for them and gives them the sense that they want to live there. It's not a house that is owned by a stranger and I'm not allowed to make significant changes to. Creates more attachment to the community I live in because I know I'm going to stay here for many, many years. So I probably am in more solidarity with my neighbors, have more of an incentive to develop the neighborhood as a whole, and so on. Opposition on the benefits of rent can argue the following. First, and probably most intuitive one, is just that rent is significantly more affordable than home ownership. And you need to prove it is inherent, but it's not that hard. Even if you're going to concede the entirety of the gov claim on home ownership becoming cheaper after the debate because there's going to be more supply of houses, cheaper still doesn't mean cheap. And the only thing you need to compare it to is the alternative of rent, which is very easy to prove from opposition will always be more affordable, if not for any other reason, because in order to get a home ownership, you need one of the two options that are usually inaccessible to poor people. Either you have a significant amount of direct saving on the short term that you can use, or you have someone who is willing to give you a significant loan that you'll be able to pay back to them in terms of mortgage. Both of these tend to be inaccessible as opposed to rent, which maybe accumulates in the long run into more money, but in the immediate term doesn't require me to have very significant amounts of savings. Second argument that would be argued from off on the benefits of rent versus home ownership are related to just the societal benefits it has. Rent leads to just much more mobility of population in general. People tend to move between houses more if they are renting as opposed to if they are buying a house. If you buy a house, you buy a prison in a sense. You're locking yourself to the ground in which you bought it. It is not as easy to replace as opposed to when you are renting and signing a contract for 1 year at each time. This means A, you can show more degree of social mobility in that sense because usually home ownership is generational wealth that is being passed on, meaning that the people who own homes in the city centers are not going to ever give them up for populations that tend to not have access to the city centers, whereas rent creates more mobility of which population is actually going to be there at any given moment. But secondly, it also means that there is more the general values of migration within a country and the utilization of a comparative advantage of different populations. I can move from my place to a different place that offers a better job opportunity for me, and this means that everyone has better access to their residence. Third clash to think of is in the area of how it impacts economic crises in general. So generally, in almost every debate about real estate or housing, there is some argument you can make about bubbles. This does not mean that you always want to make them. A lot of people do not know how to make them, and oftentimes they become a bit extreme. However, it is usually, especially in bottom half, a nice direction to think of and try to draw inspirations from. Just as a brief explanation of how we analyze a bubble in the real estate market, and then some connection of it to both sides of the debate. In general, a bubble is a mismatch between the value of an asset and the price of an asset. That means that the market misassesses the actual value of what an asset is, or gives a speculative value for an asset that ends up being worth less. In housing, this is what usually happens when you have buying apartments for the purpose of investment. This is when I buy an apartment, not because I want to live in it, or at least not exclusively because I want to live in it, but at least partially because I believe in the long run, the value of the apartment is going to increase, and then I'll be able to sell it for more than what I bought it with. And this creates a speculative effect that obviously increases prices on and on and on. From Gov, I can argue that corporate landlords are one of the biggest pushers of this trend, because they buy houses exclusively for the purpose of making profit off of them, and therefore they usually set the value of the houses on this speculative assessment of value they can get in the long run, as opposed to actual having utility value of it that is connected to short-term events. From Up, I can argue obviously the opposite, that once I will now sell all of these houses immediately to because I can no longer rent them to individuals, this creates an immediate burst of a bubble that already exists in a sense. I can claim that today, part of the value of apartments is reflecting what they should actually be worth. But once companies sell off all of the houses immediately, this means that there will be an immediate plummeting of prices down, which means that a lot of people will not be able to pay back their mortgages because their houses are now worth less, which means that a lot of investors are going to lose a lot of money because they invested a lot of money in housing, expecting the prices to rise, and now it is decreasing sharply, and so on. Which brings me to my last comment on the motion. In general, policy debates, you want to have a policy, like a model. And I think people don't often think enough on how to use it. One of the big questions in this debate is the time lag that you want to include in your model. There is the option of, let's implement this immediately, and then we force companies to immediately sell at whatever price because they have no choice. There is the alternative of making a gradual process, say making a 5 or 10 years notice, and then gradually capping the amount of houses you're allowed to rent until we reach to 0 for corporations. The thing that it changes in the debate is just the immediate market reaction. There are strategies from government that would favor the immediate selling, because this creates a more obvious immediate decrease in prices that will make housing significantly more affordable. I would, as OG, take probably the safer version of saying, let's do it gradual, so as to prevent the bubble argument from up, as well as probably make a claim a bit less accessible to bottom half in general and try to make the debate a bit narrower. But that's, I think, most of what I had to say about this motion.
So burn down things, burn down the establishments, but do it safely. So thank you everybody for the motion debrief, and thank you Jack and Geneva. Just handing it back to you and making a note that results announcements will be happening immediately after this. Thank you.
Hi everyone, just before we go off live, quick announcement: due to popular demand, we will be having one final panel tomorrow morning on the best ways and most effective ways to develop after the end of WUDC, using what you've learned in advance of your next upcoming major, whether or not that be a regional major or Madrid Worlds. So do stay tuned for that. That'll be taking place just before the first out round tomorrow, overlapping with check-in. So check the training announcement channel for details of that. Thank you.